Nvariel stood in the shadows of the trade station's lower levels, her gaze fixed on the bustling crowd below. Merchants called out to potential customers in a dozen alien languages, and the air buzzed with the hum of shuttle engines and mechanical loaders. She adjusted the hood of her cloak, masking her features. Humans were everywhere, and while she wasn't recognizable to most, there was always a chance someone might know her. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. She didn't hate them all, she reminded herself. Just the one. Her former enemy, Captain Elias Moreno, the human commander who had shattered her fleet, stripped her of rank, and sent her people scattering. The one who had left her career in tatters and her name a source of shame among her own kind. As she surveyed the crowd, she clenched her fists, trying to channel the surge of anger into calm calculation. Revenge was all she had left, and she had every intention of taking it. But to do that, she had to get closer, to understand him, to find the chink in his armor. A sharp nudge at her side brought her back to the present. The human she had hired as a guide, Max Renner, raised an eyebrow. "You planning to stand here all day, or are we going to make our move?" Max was rough around the edges. His jacket was frayed, and his boots had seen better days, but he knew the station's lower levels like the back of his hand. More importantly, he asked few questions, the kind of person who valued credits more than curiosity. "I just need a moment," she replied, her voice calm but firm. She'd long mastered the ability to speak the human tongue without a trace of hesitation, though her voice still carried the faint, lilting accent of her species. Max shrugged. "Suit yourself. Just remember, the longer we stand around, the more likely someone's going to notice we don't belong here." She studied him, noting the way he casually leaned against the railing, as if he didn't have a care in the world. But his eyes were always moving, scanning the crowd for any sign of trouble. He was cautious. She could appreciate that. "Tell me again," she said. "How did you hear about this Captain Elias Moreno?" Max smirked. "I don't just hear about people. I have sources. But yeah, Moreno's supposed to be on the station for some meeting. Rumor has it he's here to negotiate a deal for some rare tech. One of those backroom jobs nobody officially talks about." "And you're sure it's him?" "As sure as anyone can be in a place like this. Look, if you're having second thoughts, I'm not." She cut him off, her voice sharp. "Just lead the way." Max pushed off the railing and gestured for her to follow. They moved through the throng of beings, blending into the flow of foot traffic. Nvariel kept her head down, her hood casting her face in shadow. The station's lower levels were a labyrinth of corridors, cargo bays, and makeshift market stalls. Max navigated it all with ease, pausing occasionally to greet someone or slip a small credit chit into a waiting hand. It was clear he had connections, useful ones. "You've done this before," she said, more as a statement than a question. "Not my first rodeo," Max replied. "But I usually don't take jobs like this. Most of the time it's just smuggling runs, finding rare parts, that kind of thing." "And what made you take this job?" Max gave her a sidelong glance. "Let's just say I've got my own reasons for not liking certain military types. Besides, you pay well enough. But I gotta admit, you don't look like the usual kind of client." She ignored the comment, keeping her focus on their surroundings. It was best to let him think she was some disgruntled ex-officer or a rival businessperson. The truth, her identity as the once-feared General Nvariel, would only complicate things. Finally, they reached a secluded alcove, a service corridor that was quieter than the main thoroughfares. Max stopped, checking his datapad. "All right," he said. "According to my guy, Moreno should be in that room up ahead. There's a small meeting going on, but it's not heavily guarded. You sure you don't need me to stick around?" Nvariel considered him for a moment. "No, this is something I have to handle alone." Max nodded. "Your call. I'll be at the rendezvous point when you're done." As he turned to leave, she felt a brief pang of something unexpected. Gratitude, perhaps. Max wasn't a friend, but his help had been invaluable. She would remember that. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, her heart pounding. Her mind raced through the possibilities. What she would say, how she would confront him. whether she would walk away or end it here and now. But as she reached the door, she hesitated. The hatred she had nurtured for so long was still there, but it was mingled with uncertainty. She didn't know what she expected to find on the other side. Squaring her shoulders, Nvariel reached for the control panel. Whatever happened next, she was ready to face it. Elias Moreno sat at the corner of the noisy cantina, a half-empty glass of something local in front of him. The place was alive with chatter. Traders haggling over prices, spacers swapping exaggerated tales of daring escapes, and the occasional burst of laughter from a card table in the back. He was waiting, though he wasn't sure for what. Another round? A woman's voice asked from behind the bar. He looked up and shook his head. Still working on this one. The bartender shrugged and moved down the line. Elias leaned back in his chair, letting the hum of the room wash over him. This was the life he had chosen after the war. Quiet, under the radar, and far removed from the politics and tensions that came with command. But the past had a way of catching up. Captain Moreno, right? The voice came from a man standing at his table, tall and lanky, with the kind of grin that suggested he'd either sell you something or pick your pocket. Maybe both. Just Elias, Moreno replied. Who's asking? Name's Max, the man said, pulling out a chair without waiting for an invitation. I hear you're looking for information. Elias studied him for a moment, then nodded. Depends. What kind of information? Max leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. I've got a lead on someone who's been asking around about you. Someone not from around here, if you catch my drift. Elias tensed. Go on. Female, Max said. Not human. Kept her face covered. But from what I've heard, she's not just passing through. Sounds like she's been watching you, asking questions. Elias set his glass down, suddenly not thirsty. And you know this because? Let's just say I've got ears in places most people don't, Max replied. I can help you find out who she is. For a price. Elias frowned. Why should I trust you? Max shrugged. You don't have to. But if I were you, I'd want to know why someone from the other side of the galaxy is so interested in me. Elias thought about it. The last thing he wanted was trouble. But the idea of an unknown alien tracking his movements didn't sit well. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. What's your price? Not much. Couple hundred credits. Just enough to keep the lights on, Max said. What do you say? Elias sighed. Fine. Tell me what you know. Max grinned again. Great. Let's find a quieter spot to talk. They left the cantina and made their way down a side corridor, the sound of the bustling station fading as they moved further from the main thoroughfares. Max stopped near a maintenance hatch and turned to face Elias. She's staying in one of the low-rent quarters, Max said. Been there for a few days. Mostly keeps to herself, but every so often she's out in the marketplace. Seems to be looking for someone. Elias crossed his arms. Why come to me with this? What's in it for you? Max's grin faded slightly. I've got my reasons. Let's just say I'm not a fan of folks stirring up trouble. Especially not with people who've had enough of it already. Kind of you to be so concerned, Elias said, his tone dry. Hey, take it or leave it, Max replied. All I know is, she's been asking questions that lead right to you. Figured you'd want to know before she showed up at your front door. Elias considered his options. He had no desire to get involved in whatever this was, but ignoring it didn't seem wise. All right, he said finally. Show me where she is. Max nodded and led the way through a maze of hallways and stairwells. The station's lower levels were darker, quieter, and had a distinct smell of stale air. It was a far cry from the more polished sections above. They stopped outside a nondescript door. This is it, Max said. She's in there. Want me to stick around? No, Elias said. I'll handle it. Max held up his hands. Fair enough. Good luck. Elias waited until Max had disappeared before stepping toward the door. He hesitated, then tapped the control panel. The door slid open and he stepped inside. The room was small, dimly lit, and sparsely furnished. Nvariel was seated at the lone table, her hood down, her sharp features unmistakable. Her blue skin seemed to glow faintly in the low light. She looked up, her golden eyes locking onto his. "Captain Moreno," she said, her voice even. "I've been expecting you." Elias stopped just inside the doorway. "I'm not sure who you are or why you're looking for me, but I don't appreciate being followed." Nvariel stood, her movements smooth and deliberate. "I'm not here to follow you," she said. "I'm here to understand." "Understand what?" he asked, frowning. She tilted her head slightly. "Why you spared my fleet when you had every reason to destroy it. Why you let us go when you could have ended the war right then and there." Elias blinked, caught off guard by her question. "I didn't spare anyone. You retreated." "We retreated because you gave us time to do so," she said. "You held back. I've seen the footage. You had us cornered, and you hesitated. I want to know why." Elias ran a hand through his hair, unsure how to answer. "I don't know what you think you saw, but the truth is, you spared us," she interrupted. "And I want to know why." Elias sighed. "I'm not the man you think I am. If you're looking for answers, you might be disappointed." Nvariel crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "I'll be the judge of that." The station's maintenance hub was a maze of pipes, control panels, and flashing indicators. Elias followed Nvariel closely, his steps echoing slightly in the narrow corridors. She carried herself with a deliberate confidence, as though she knew exactly where she was going, though he wasn't sure if she actually did. "This way," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "And you're sure the relay is down here?" Elias asked. "I've been through these levels a dozen times and never noticed anything that looked like an active signal booster." "It's not exactly out in the open," Nvariel replied. "But if what you told me is true, about the fluctuations and the pattern of interference, this is where we'll find it." Max, who had tagged along at Elias's request, trailed behind them, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "I don't know, Captain. This whole setup smells like a trap to me. Who leaves a vital piece of equipment like that buried down here with no guards?" "Not every solution involves guards and guns," Nvariel said. "Sometimes the best way to hide something is to make it look like junk." Max raised an eyebrow. "Right? Well, if we get jumped, just remember it was your idea to come down here." "Enough," Elias said, his voice firm. "We're all in this now. Let's focus." They turned another corner, and Nvariel stopped in front of a wall-mounted panel that didn't look any different from the others they'd passed. She examined it carefully, tracing a finger along its edges before pulling a tool from her belt. Elias watched her work, noticing how quickly she identified the hidden latches and began prying open a concealed compartment. "Not bad," he said. "I wasn't a general because of my looks," she replied without turning. Max snorted. "Could have fooled me." Elias shot him a warning glance, and Max held up his hands in mock surrender. All right, I'll keep it professional." Nvariel pulled back the final panel, revealing a small device nestled among a tangle of wires. It pulsed faintly, emitting a rhythmic, almost hypnotic glow. "This is it," she said. Elias stepped closer, studying the device. "So it really is some sort of relay. But who put it here?" "Could be anyone," Max said. "This station's changed hands so many times, it's hard to keep track." Nvariel examined the connections carefully. "It's definitely not human tech, and it's not from my people either. Someone else is involved." "That's not exactly comforting," Elias said. "Can you shut it down?" Nvariel hesitated. "Not without knowing what it's connected to. Could be relaying data off-station, or it might be part of a larger network. If I disable it here, it could trigger something somewhere else." "So what do you suggest?" Elias asked. She glanced at him, her golden eyes catching the dim light. "I need more time to analyze it, and I'll need your help. If this relay is connected to something outside the station, we'll need to track the signal. You know the system here better than I do." Elias nodded. "Fine, I'll help, but we need to keep this quiet. If someone finds out we're poking around down here, we'll deal with it," Nvariel said firmly. I'm really starting to regret getting involved in this, Max muttered. All I wanted was a quick job. Now we're tampering with alien devices and who knows what else. Elias clapped a hand on his shoulder. Relax. You're already in too deep to back out now. Great. That's just what I wanted to hear. Nvariel worked quickly, using her tools to tap into the relay's data streams. As she deciphered the signals, Elias monitored the nearby station systems, watching for any unexpected changes. Max stood guard, his eyes darting nervously down the corridor. Got something, Nvariel said after a few minutes. There's a secondary link here, something connected to another module deeper in the station's infrastructure. If we can find that, we might learn more about who's behind this. Let me guess, Max said. You want us to go on another little expedition? It's the only way, Nvariel replied. Elias studied her face, noticing the determined set of her jaw. Despite everything, he found himself starting to trust her. She wasn't just chasing ghosts. She was putting the pieces together. And while he still had questions about her motives, he couldn't deny that they made a good team. All right, he said. Let's find that other module. As they moved deeper into the station, the corridors grew darker and quieter. The only sound was the occasional hum of machinery and the faint echo of their footsteps. Max, bringing up the rear, glanced over his shoulder nervously. I never really liked these lower levels, he said. Too many places for something to jump out at you. Elias looked back at him, his brow furrowed. We're not going to get jumped. It's just an old section of the station. Max shrugged. Sure, if you say so. But if I disappear, don't say I didn't warn you. Nvariel, leading the way, gave Max a sidelong glance. We have more pressing concerns than ghosts or rogue maintenance bots. Still, a little caution never hurt anyone, Max muttered. They reached a fork in the corridor, and Nvariel paused, studying the faint markings on the wall. She held up a small scanning device, watching the readout. The signal splits here. One route leads toward what looks like an old communications array. The other heads into some kind of power relay chamber. Elias crossed his arms. What do you think? I think we should split up, Nvariel said. I'll take the route to the communications array. You and Max check the power relay chamber. If the signal's stronger there, we'll know where to focus. Elias didn't like splitting the group, but he understood the logic. All right, let's keep comms open. If you run into trouble, call for backup. Same to you, Nvariel said, giving him a nod before heading down the left corridor. Elias turned to Max. Come on. Let's see what's in that power relay chamber. Max sighed. I just know I'm going to regret this. The two men made their way down the right-hand corridor, the air growing noticeably cooler as they descended. The walls here were older, with exposed wiring and occasional patches of corrosion. It was clear this part of the station hadn't been maintained in years. Elias kept a steady pace, scanning his surroundings. Max followed, muttering under his breath about faulty lights and potential safety hazards. Eventually, they reached a large, rusted door. Elias examined the control panel. It's locked, but I think I can bypass it. Give me a second. Max leaned against the wall, watching him work. You ever wonder why someone would leave a perfectly good station to rot like this? I mean, look at this place. It's falling apart. It happens, Elias replied, focused on the panel. Sometimes stations lose funding, trade routes shift, or newer facilities make them obsolete. Yeah, but it feels like more than that, Max said. Like someone wanted this place forgotten. Elias didn't answer. He was too busy bypassing the lock. After a few moments, the panel beeped, and the door creaked open. A cool breeze of stale air greeted them as they stepped inside. The chamber was vast, with rows of inactive power conduits running along the walls. In the center was a control console, covered in a thin layer of dust. Elias approached it, brushing off the grime. The interface was alien, but he recognized certain patterns. Indicators of power levels, relay status, and a data stream that seemed to match what Nvariel had found. This is definitely part of the same network, Elias said. Looks like it's been dormant for a while, though. We might be able to trace the signal from here. Max frowned. What if turning it on alerts whoever set it up? That's a risk we'll have to take, Elias replied. I'll keep it on a low power setting, just enough to get a trace. He began working on the console, carefully activating the systems. Lights flickered on the conduits, and a faint hum filled the chamber. Max kept his distance, his hand resting on the blaster holstered at his side. I don't like this. Keep your eyes open, Elias said. Let me know if anything changes. Minutes passed as Elias worked. He managed to establish a connection to the relay network, watching as data streams began to flow across the interface. The patterns were complex, but he could see the faint signature of an off-station link. There it is, he muttered. It's sending data somewhere beyond the station. If I can isolate the destination. A sudden noise interrupted him. Max turned, drawing his blaster. What was that? Elias froze, listening. The sound was faint, like the shuffle of metal on metal. It came from the far end of the chamber. Stay sharp, Elias said, standing slowly. He scanned the room, but nothing moved. The conduits continued to hum softly, the console's interface glowing steadily. Maybe it's just the system starting up again, Max offered, though he didn't lower his weapon. Maybe, Elias said, though he didn't believe it. They waited, tense, but the sound didn't repeat. Elias turned back to the console, finishing the trace. I've got a direction, he said. It's Leedy. Their steps, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching them. But there was no time to dwell on it now. They had a lead, and Varial needed to know what they'd found. Elias and Max hurried back through the winding corridors. The faint hum of the station's aging infrastructure accompanied them, a steady reminder that the deeper sections weren't entirely stable. Max glanced over his shoulder every few steps, his hand never far from the blaster at his side. I'm telling you, something was back there, Max muttered. I know what I heard. Elias kept his eyes forward. I don't doubt you, but we need to focus. If we lose track of Varial, this lead goes cold. Max snorted. Right? Because that's exactly what we need. Her wandering off on her own, playing hero. She's capable, Elias said, his tone firm. More than you think. Max shook his head, muttering something under his breath as they reached the junction where they'd split up. Varial wasn't there. Elias checked his communicator, tapping into their shared channel. Varial, do you read me? We have the signal source. A moment of static followed, then her voice crackled through. I'm here. The array was a dead end, nothing but ancient equipment. Did you find anything useful? We traced the signal to an external sector just outside station control, Elias said. Whatever's behind this, it's not confined to the station. We need to regroup and figure out our next move. Understood, Varial replied. Meet me back at the main lift. I'll be waiting. Elias closed the channel and nodded toward the nearest lift access point. Let's move. They retraced their path, eventually reaching the lift shaft. Varial was there, standing just out of sight, scanning her surroundings. She spotted them immediately and approached, her movements precise and deliberate. What exactly did you find? She asked. Elias handed her a small data slate, showing the route they'd uncovered. The relay in the power chamber was active enough to give us a direction. The signal leads to a sector off-station. If we can get there, we might find out who's behind this. Varial studied the slate, her brow furrowing slightly. This is outside the station's security net. Could be a hidden outpost or a remote data center. Max crossed his arms. Or it could be nothing. Just a dead lead. Elias glanced at him. It's the only lead we've got. Varial looked up. Then we follow it. But we'll need more than just us. If this is something bigger, we don't need to draw attention, Elias interrupted. The last thing we need is station security sniffing around and shutting us down before we get close. We keep this quiet. Max raised an eyebrow. So just the three of us, then? Against whoever might be on the other side of that signal. Varial gave him a level look. If that worries you, you're free to walk away. Max's lips twitched into a smirk. You think you're intimidating me? I'm just pointing out the obvious. Enough, Elias said, his voice firm. We stick together, we keep a low profile, and we see this through. Nvariel nodded, her sharp gaze shifting to Elias. What's our next step? We get a transport, Elias said. Something small, unregistered. I know a guy who owes me a favor. Max chuckled. That's a first. Someone owing you something. Elias shot him a look. Just follow me. I'll handle the rest. The three of them made their way to the upper levels, avoiding main thoroughfares and security checkpoints. Max grumbled about the long walk, but Nvariel remained silent, her focus never wavering. Elias occasionally glanced back at her, curious. She wasn't just determined. She was relentless. He couldn't help but wonder what was really driving her. Was it just curiosity about the signal or something deeper? When they finally reached the dockyard, Elias guided them to a small hangar tucked away from the larger berths. The transport inside was a modest vessel, hardly a military-grade ship, but it would get them where they needed to go. A man in greasy overalls greeted them, wiping his hands on a rag. Elias, he said, his voice a gravelly drawl. Long time. Good to see you, Ren, Elias replied. I need a favor. Don't you always? Ren eyed the group. Who's the crew? Just colleagues, Elias said quickly. We need to borrow the ship. Ren rubbed his chin, glancing at Nvariel and Max. Borrow? Huh? What kind of trouble are you getting me into this time? No trouble, Elias said. We just need a quick run. You'll get it back in one piece. Ren grunted. You'd better. Fine. Just don't tell me what you're up to. I don't want to know. Thanks, Ren. Elias gestured to the others. Let's get moving. Once aboard, Elias took the pilot's seat. Nvariel sat beside him, and Max settled in the back, muttering about his lack of seat padding. Elias powered up the engines and ran a quick systems check. The ship hummed to life, and the hangar doors opened, revealing the dark expanse of space beyond. As they left the station behind, Elias glanced at Nvariel. We follow the signal. No stops, no distractions. She nodded. Agreed. Max leaned forward from the back. This better be worth it. Elias smirked. It will be. The small ship shuddered as it slipped through the asteroid field, its maneuvering thrusters firing in short, sharp bursts. Elias kept a firm grip on the controls, eyes flicking between the navigational display and the looming chunks of rock outside. The signal from the relay was stronger now, directing them toward a particular asteroid deep in the field. Nvariel sat in the co-pilot's seat, her focus on a datapad showing the signal's pattern. Max leaned in the doorway behind them, arms crossed. I've got a bad feeling about this, Max said. You always have a bad feeling, Elias muttered. He rolled the ship gently to avoid a larger asteroid, the engines straining as they passed. This is different, Max continued. We're heading straight into the middle of nowhere, following a signal we barely understand, and the only backup we've got is each other. Nvariel glanced back at him. No one's forcing you to be here, Max scowled. Yeah. Well, someone's got to keep an eye on you too. Then sit down and let us work, Elias said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. We're close. Just let me focus. Max muttered something under his breath but moved to one of the rear seats, buckling himself in. Nvariel returned her attention to the datapad. It's faint, but the source is definitely on that asteroid, she said, pointing at the display. There's some kind of structure there, partially buried, possibly abandoned. Great, Elias said dryly. An abandoned structure in the middle of a death trap. Sounds like fun. Nvariel ignored the sarcasm. You're the one who said we need to find out who's behind this. This is the only lead we've got. Elias nodded, his expression serious. I know. I just wish the lead wasn't surrounded by giant floating rocks. Nvariel's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Just keep us in one piece. I'll handle the rest once we're inside. Sounds fair, Elias replied. He brought the ship around, aiming for the asteroid's shadowed surface. The signal was strongest here, and a faint metallic glint suggested the presence of something artificial. Max prepped the suits. Looks like we'll be doing a bit of EVA. Terrific, Max said, heading to the storage lockers. Nothing I like better than floating around in space with nothing between me and a vacuum but a thin layer of fabric. Quit complaining, Nvariel said, rising from her seat. We're all in this together. Max gave her a mock salute. Yes, ma'am. Elias powered down the ship's engines and activated the magnetic clamps, securing it to the asteroid's surface. Once they were suited up and ready, the three of them exited the airlock, their boots clanging softly on the metal plating as their maglocks engaged. The structure ahead was clearly alien, angular and asymmetrical, with faintly glowing lines etched into its surface. It jutted out from the asteroid like a long-forgotten monument, its purpose unclear. All right, let's stay sharp, Elias said, leading the way. If this thing's been here a while, who knows what kind of surprises are inside. I thought you said no one would be here, Max said. I said it looked abandoned, Nvariel corrected. But we won't know for sure until we get in. They reached a large hatch that appeared sealed. Nvariel knelt down, her gloved fingers tracing the edges of the panel. There's a manual release here. Give me a moment. Max glanced around nervously, his hand drifting toward his holstered weapon. Anyone else feel like we're being watched? No one's watching us, Elias said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. The place was eerily silent, the only sounds the faint hum of their suit radios and the occasional crunch of gravel underfoot. Nvariel worked quickly, finally managing to override the locking mechanism. The hatch hissed open, revealing a dark interior. Elias switched on his helmet light, the beam cutting through the shadows. Stay close, he said, stepping inside. The air was stale but still breathable, suggesting the place had its own life support system. The walls were covered in strange patterns, intricate designs that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Nvariel studied them intently, while Max kept glancing behind them. They moved deeper into the structure, following the signal. It led them down narrow corridors and through a series of chambers that seemed more like laboratories than living quarters. Scattered equipment lay dormant, covered in a thin layer of dust. This place has been here for a long time, Nvariel said. Whoever built it left in a hurry. Or never left, Max muttered. Elias turned a corner and stopped abruptly. In the center of the next room was a large console, its surface glowing faintly. The signal source was here, unmistakable. He approached cautiously, glancing back at Nvariel. Can you make sense of this? She joined him at the console, studying the alien glyphs and the pulsing light. It's a control interface, but I'll need time to decipher it. Keep an eye on the entrances. I don't want to be interrupted. Elias nodded and motioned for Max to cover the door. We'll hold the line. Just do what you need to do. As Nvariel worked, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had brought them here for a reason. But for now, all he could do was stay alert and trust Nvariel to find the answers they needed. The glow of the alien console pulsed steadily, casting the room in shifting shades of blue and green. Nvariel worked in silence, her gloved fingers gliding over the symbols as she tried to decode the interface. Elias stood a few paces behind her, his arms crossed, his eyes constantly scanning the room's entrances. Max leaned against the far wall, his blaster out, fingers drumming nervously against the grip. Any idea how much longer this is going to take? Max asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. Not really, Nvariel replied without looking up. This isn't exactly straightforward. Max sighed, his head thudding lightly against the wall. Figures. It's never straightforward. Elias shot him a look. You volunteered to come along, remember? Doesn't mean I can't complain, Max said. I mean, it's not like we're on a timer or anything. Oh wait, we are. Because who knows what's on its way here. Nvariel stopped briefly, turning her head to address him. If you're that nervous, maybe you should take a walk outside. All right, fine. I'll shut up, Max muttered. Not like I have anywhere else to go. Elias moved a bit closer to Nvariel, keeping his voice low. Do you have any idea what you're looking at? Anything useful? Nvariel nodded slightly. It's some kind of relay hub, just like we thought. But it's more advanced than I've seen before. It's not just sending data, it's filtering it. Whatever information comes through here, it's being cleaned up, organized, and then forwarded somewhere else. Any clue where? Elias asked. I'm working on that, she said. The signals are encrypted, but if I can crack the pattern, I might be able to get a location. Elias nodded. All right, just keep at it. We'll handle security. Max cleared his throat. Speaking of security, anyone else hear that? Elias froze, tilting his head slightly. A faint sound reached his ears. Something mechanical, like a distant drone. He gestured for Max to check the corridor while he approached Nvariel. Max is right, he said. We're not alone. Nvariel glanced at him but didn't stop working. I need more time. I'm not saying to stop, Elias said, pulling his weapon. Just be ready. Max reappeared at the doorway, his expression tense. There's definitely something moving out there. I couldn't see it, but it's coming this way. Elias moved toward the door, motioning for Max to take the other side. Stay quiet. Don't shoot unless you have to. Max muttered something inaudible, but he positioned himself at the entrance, weapon raised. Elias peeked around the corner, his pulse quickening as the noise grew louder. Then he saw it. Something metallic, hovering just above the floor. It resembled a drone, but it was larger, bulkier, and covered in strange symbols. Its movements were precise, deliberate, as though it were searching for something or someone. Elias signaled to Max, motioning for him to hold his position. The two watched as the drone moved closer, its sensors scanning the walls. When it reached the door to their chamber, it paused, hovering in place. Elias held his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger. But the drone didn't fire. Instead, it emitted a faint hum, as if it were broadcasting a signal of its own. Nvariel suddenly looked up from the console. Whatever that thing is, it just pinged the relay. It's trying to access the same data. Elias looked back at her. Can you stop it? I can try, she said, her fingers flying over the console. But if it detects what I'm doing. The drone's hum grew louder, and a small panel on its side began to open. Max's grip on his weapon tightened. I think it's about to do something. Wait, Nvariel called. Don't shoot. It might just be. A burst of energy shot from the drone, striking the console. Sparks flew, and the lights flickered. Nvariel jumped back, cursing under her breath. Okay, now you can shoot, she shouted. Elias didn't hesitate. He opened fire, the sharp crack of his weapon echoing through the chamber. Max joined in, their shots striking the drone's armor. The machine retaliated, firing off another burst that narrowly missed Elias and scorched the wall behind him. Fall back, Elias yelled. Nvariel, can you move? She nodded, grabbing her tools and backing away from the console. The drone pressed forward, its hum now a sharp, piercing whine. Elias covered her retreat, firing until his weapon overheated. Get to the ship. Max, go. Max didn't need to be told twice. He broke into a run, firing a few shots over his shoulder as he moved. Nvariel was right behind him, clutching the data slate she'd managed to save. Elias was the last to leave, firing one last shot at the drone sensors before turning and sprinting after them. As they reached the airlock and re-entered the ship, the drone's hum faded, and they sealed the hatch. Elias collapsed into the pilot's seat, quickly bringing the engines online. That thing's not going to stop, Max said, panting. It's going to come after us. Not if we move fast enough, Elias said. He glanced at Nvariel. Did you get what you needed? She held up the slate. Most of it. Enough to figure out where the signal leads. Elias exhaled, relief mixing with the lingering tension. Good. Let's get out of here before that thing decides to follow. The ship lifted off the asteroid surface, and Elias angled it back toward open space. As the stars came into view, He couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of whatever they'd stumbled into. The ship drifted in orbit above a barren moon, its engines quiet as Elias, Nvariel, and Max crowded around the cockpit console. The slate Nvariel had salvaged sat in the center of the small table, projecting a holographic map. Lines and markers flickered across the display, converging on a distant point far from any known trade routes or settled systems. "This is it," Nvariel said, her finger tracing a glowing line. "The signal originates from here." Max squinted at the map. "You're saying we came all this way just to find a dead rock in the middle of nowhere?" Elias frowned. "It's not a dead rock. There's something there, some kind of structure. The scans show a lot of interference, but it's definitely artificial." Nvariel tapped another marker. "This is the relay hub we found on the asteroid. It wasn't just forwarding data, it was hiding the source. Whoever set this up didn't want anyone tracing it back." Max leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Sounds like whoever's behind it went through a lot of trouble. And here we are, just walking straight into it. Anyone else think this might be a bad idea?" "It's our only lead," Elias said. "We've come this far. We can't just turn back now." Nvariel nodded. "If we stop here, we'll never know who's behind this network or what they're doing with the data. The longer we wait, the more time they have to cover their tracks." Max sighed. "Fine. But if we get shot at again, I'm officially done." Elias smirked. "Noted. Let's prep for descent." The three of them moved quickly. Max double-checked the ship's defensive systems, grumbling the whole time about being the only one who cared about staying alive. Nvariel reviewed the signal data, looking for any clues that might give them an advantage. Elias ran through a quick systems check before taking the pilot's seat. "Strap in," Elias said as the ship's engines flared. "This might get rough." The ship dropped through the moon's thin atmosphere, the surface rising up to meet them. As they got closer, the outline of a sprawling facility became clear. It was partially buried, its metallic walls blending almost seamlessly with the rocky terrain. The interference grew stronger, causing the ship's sensors to flicker and their communications to cut in and out. "Whatever's down there, it doesn't want us poking around," Elias said. "That just makes me want to poke around even more," Nvariel replied, her gaze fixed on the approaching structure. Max shook his head. "You two are nuts." Elias guided the ship toward a relatively flat stretch of ground near the facility. The landing gear extended, and the ship touched down with a gentle thud. He powered down the engines but left the ship ready for a quick departure. "All right," he said, unbuckling his harness. "Let's find out what's going on here." They stepped out onto the moon's surface, their boots crunching against the gravel-like ground. The facility loomed ahead, its walls dark and foreboding. There were no lights, no movement, just the low hum of energy pulsing through the ground beneath their feet. "Place looks abandoned," Max said, scanning the area with a handheld device. "Looks can be deceiving," Nvariel replied. She pointed to a faint glow near one of the entrance doors. "There's still power. Someone's been here recently." Elias approached the door, examining the facility. Within moments, the lock clicked, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. "Nice work," Nvariel said, stepping inside. The air was cold, and the interior was just as dark and foreboding as the exterior. Faint lines of light ran along the floor, guiding them deeper into the structure. The three of them moved cautiously, weapons drawn. The hallways were empty, but the sense of being watched lingered. Each step echoed off the walls, the sound making the space feel even larger and more hollow. "Still think this place is abandoned?" Max whispered. "Stay focused," Elias said. "Nvariel, how's that signal?" She checked her device. "It's strongest up ahead. We're close." They followed the signal through a series of chambers, each one more complex than the last. Strange machines lined the walls, their functions unclear. The air grew warmer, and the hum grew louder. At the center of the facility, they found a large chamber housing an enormous console. The console pulsed with the same glow as the relay they'd found earlier, and the signal was strongest here. "This is it," Nvariel said, stepping forward. This is where the network starts. Elias and Max took up positions on either side of her, watching the entrances. Can you shut it down? Elias asked. I'm not sure yet, Nvariel replied. I need to see what it's doing first. She began working on the console, her fingers moving rapidly over the controls. The patterns of light shifted as she accessed deeper layers of the system. Data streams appeared on the display, lines of alien code that seemed to flow endlessly. Someone's been using this to monitor entire sectors, Nvariel said, her voice tense. They're gathering information on trade routes, resource deposits, even population movements. And it's all being sent to a central location. Where? Elias asked. Nvariel frowned, studying the data. It's not clear. The final destination is heavily encrypted. Of course it is, Max said, rolling his eyes. Can you trace it? I'm trying, Nvariel said. But it's going to take time. Elias scanned the room. You'd better work fast. We've been here too long already. As Nvariel continued to work, the hum in the room grew louder. Max shifted uneasily. You know, if this thing wakes up or sets off an alarm, I'm going to say I told you so. We're not going to let it get that far, Elias said. Just stay alert. Time stretched on as Nvariel fought to break through the encryption. The tension in the room was palpable, each of them keenly aware that they were deep in enemy territory. Finally, Nvariel let out a small breath. I've got something. It's coordinates. A system far out on the edge of known space. What's out there? Elias asked. I don't know, Nvariel said. But whoever set this up, that's where they're operating from. Elias nodded. Then that's where we're going next.